It's 2 o'clock. Are we live? Good. I'd like to call this meeting of the Planning Commission, Rehoboth Beach Planning Commission, to order. It's September 9th, 2022 at 2 o'clock p.m. And the secretary is not with us, but Vice Chair Nan Hunter, would you please call the roll?
Certainly. Mr. Covington, I believe, is absent. Mr. Dewey.
Present.
Mr. Strange.
Present.
Ms. Maka.
Present.
Mr. Ellison.
Present.
Ms. Davis, also absent, I think. Hunter is here. Mr. Kaufman.
Present.
And Chair Bryan.
I'm here. Thank you. It's good to see everyone. I think this is our full meeting, first full meeting in person, so it's welcome. First matter is approval of previous minutes, and there are a group. Ms. Womack, I have in my packet everything but January 5th, I think, 2022. I see that referenced here.
You have November 12th, November 18th, December 6th. January 14th.
There you go.
January 28th, February 17th, April 22nd, April 29th, and May 13th.
That's correct. I did not recollect seeing the January 5th, so I think the appropriate motion would be to approve those meetings that we just outlined with the exception of January 5th, which appears on the agenda but is not in the packet. Do I have such a motion?
I move.
Have a motion, a second?
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. That takes us through the CDP phase of our work. Any correspondence, Ms. Womack?
I haven't received any.
Any old business? If I may change the agenda just slightly to bring the other business items, Building Inspector's Report, Planning Commission Solicitor's Report, City Planner's Report, and report of any new applications, if I may bring that up at this time. So if I could, please, the Building Inspector. Please tell us what's going on in your world.
Thank you, Chair. Currently, I believe the commissioners have forwarded you a zoning request that came from the last meeting, so you'll see that probably on your next agenda. It is a zoning request for, I'm not sure of the exact address, but it's on Coastal Highway. It is beside the auto shop, and it's for the property that abuts the auto repair shop to the north of that property.
So this is the business known as Rehoboth Auto Repair?
You are correct.
And are they seeking a rezoning of an adjacent parcel and not the primary business parcel? Is that what's before us?
That is
or will be
correct.
before us?
That is correct. I believe they're going from a C3 to a C1, or they're requesting such.
Okay.
Okay? A vicious rumor mill, of course, is that Bellhaven will be coming back in for their resubmittal. I did talk to the architect of record probably about 2 weeks ago. They did say that 2 weeks ago Monday was when they were going to be dropping that plan off. However, we've not seen anything to date. So we're still waiting on that resubmission. Of course, I'd have my normal customary 30 days to do my report. And then I would forward it on as long as it, meets the intent of the code.
Okay.
Rumor mill, of course, with the other hotels. We have a couple commercial properties that obviously are changing hands, with a couple restaurants that are just kind of changing in kind. No major issues there. And then we also have a proposal for a Baltimore Avenue hotel, but it's not anything submitted officially yet. So it's just all of this stuff is in the pipeline, so I think we're going to have a very busy winter.
I suppose that's a good thing.
Better than the alternative, perhaps.
Chair, could I ask a question, please?
Sure.
of the building inspector? Are you so I know they do a lot of electronic submittals, but for the major projects, are you requesting at least D-size drawings so we can physically have them and see them?
Thank you, Mr. Strange. Yes, I am. So as part of the submittal packet, everything they submit in a paper form needs to be submitted in an e-file as well.
Okay.
I also have a question, if I might. Mr. Janis, I'm wondering if you could add to your written report the addresses of these projects. I mean, I find it, in looking at this, I actually don't know really sort of what is, much about what's going on because of the summary descriptions.
Certainly, not a problem at all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I noticed that on this, on the report that we get, I mean, it doesn't come up on what's before me now because it's in black and white, but sometimes the descriptions seem to be a link, which is to say they're blue and underlined and so forth. But the links, in my experience, don't work. So is there a reason for that? Could that be fixed?
That might stem from IT. I'll take a look at that. And it also might be inter-program that we use to process our permits. So it might be developing a link that obviously general public or various commissions and boards would not have access to. We'll take a look at it and adjust it going forward.
Great, thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.
Yeah, I think the commissioner would just like as much information as we can as to what's going on in your office
Absolutely,
in terms of upcoming projects.
absolutely.
Any other questions for the building inspector? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Janis, will you be available too and for our next agenda item concerning just a
Absolutely, Chair.
discussion of?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be right here for you.
Okay, good. This Planning Commission Solicitors Report, please. Mr. Mehta.
Good afternoon, Luke Mehta, the Solicitor for the Planning Commission. Just an update on legal proceedings with which you are, I suspect, already very familiar. In the Belhaven matter, which is the Superior Court appeal or writ of certiorari appeal of a Board of Adjustment decision granting an FAR variance request, oral argument on that, let's call it an appeal, was held last week, which commences the 90-day clock for a decision by the Superior Court unless the court asks for additional briefing, which is possible. There are indications from the oral argument that may happen, so that may be pushed out beyond 30 days from last week. 330 Rehoboth Avenue, that is the lawsuit against the city, including this body as well as the Board of Commissioners, with regard to the denial of the rezoning request, oral argument on a motion to dismiss that matter. Briefing has been completed, and no oral argument has been set. I'm sorry, so briefing has been completed, no oral argument has been set. The court may or may not wish to have oral argument on that matter. And finally, the Beach Walk matter, that's before the Delaware Supreme Court, and the 60-day clock from argument to the presumptive decision deadline will expire later this month on the 20th. So it's conceivable that there will be a Supreme Court decision in the Beach Walk matter later this month.
That's it. All right, thank you. Nick Walls, please come up. Members of the commission, this is Nick Walls. He's with Wallace Montgomery. Nick is our planner. Lauren Good is unavailable, and we're not exactly sure why. I don't even think you know. I don't. And we wish her the best for whatever the problem is. But we thank you for filling in and maybe staying, who knows. Can you give us an update on where things, I know this is your first meeting, so it's not a fair question, but do you have anything to report, sir?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all commissioners for letting me attend and replace Lauren Good. Hopefully, she is on the mend, or her family. As I said, we don't really have much insight into that. So over the past couple weeks, I've met with Mr. Bryan, Mr. Mayor as well, a couple other staff in the town to try and get myself up to speed on all of the everything that is going on right now. Excuse me. So I've started to get into some of the discussions on the tree code from the mayor's perspective and looking at some of the revisions there. Also provided some input on when site plans can be required and how to proceed with that. And have started to look into, or at least wrap my head around all of the hotel issues that might be coming up soon, or the ones that are already here and the ones that may be forthcoming in the future too. So I'm trying to get up to speed, but if there's anything that anybody would like to bring to my attention in particular, please don't hesitate, just let me know. I'm here to help and serve you guys.
Well, Nick and I certainly have spent a lot of time getting acquainted on the phone over the past 2 weeks, talking about what is here and what's coming. So I think we've made some progress in that regard, and do look forward to having you as a very important resource for this commission, given what's on our future agenda.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Matt, Janice, if I can just ask you where you are there any new applications that have been filed? And you gentlemen are welcome to just stay right there. Any new applications besides what you say the scuttlebutt is?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Not to date. Of course, Rumor Mill has several applications coming in, but again, as my earlier example, we get phone calls and then no one shows up to submit the documentation. So until we have something official, we'll just move on that basis.
Okay, that sounds fine. Thank you. Then the general topic for today for discussion, Luke, if you would, I think we've broken it down. It's primarily a general discussion about where the Planning Commission what you would like to consider involving Section 236-30 and 236-32 of the Municipal Code. This has to do with site plan reviews. The one subject is, for example, is at the building commissioner's level, when does something come before you and then get passed on to the commission? What requirements, what threshold facts need to be present before the building inspector to make a decision? What's your thought about how that should be handled? We're not here today to make a decision about those things, but I wanted to introduce the topic so that the commission can consider it and perhaps act once it's been discussed and looked at, researched, all the good things that we need to do. Mr. Mehta, if you would start me with that then.
So sure, I'm happy just to tee up the issues. As people probably know, the mayor and the mayor and commissioners have referred specifically to this body the issue of looking at Section 236-30 of the the City Code to conduct a review of 236-30 to focus on Section 236-30A in particular for clarity of intent and efficacy. That referral, I think it's fair to say, arises out of a couple of Board of Commissioner hearings earlier this summer, where there was some public discussion about whether a building permit regarding the Sandcastle Hotel should have been issued without the Planning Commission reviewing a site plan. That's basically the issue. So if you look at Section 236-30, no ordinance, no city code is perfect. There's always going to be some ambiguity. And so the question is whether the issues that have been raised this past summer suggest that Section 23630 could be tightened up. And as a general matter, what I would, and I've, in my experience, let me put it that way, I think everybody wins, the stakeholders win, the public wins when the relevant statute or ordinance is as clear as possible. You can't anticipate everything, but the greater the clarity there is in terms of where the discretion relies, where the decision resides with the building inspector, and where a project must go to the Planning Commission, the greater that this body and ultimately the Board of Commissioners can articulate what is in one ambit and what is in another ambit, seems to me is would be a good thing for everybody. And I think I would suspect that's probably why the language of the referral includes clarity of intent and efficacy.
So really what this body would be doing is making a recommendation back to the Board of Commissioners.
Yeah, the Planning Commission obviously does not have the authority to amend the code. The request from the mayor and commissioners that this body takes a look at 23630, 236A in particular, and makes recommendations how to, for want of a better phrase, tighten up that language for the future. Of course, this is all for future projects. For today's purposes, I would recommend that you only talk about this matter in general terms. At a future Planning Commission meeting, you may want to discuss some specific issues in more detail and maybe even make decisions on recommending, but that should be for a future meeting, not today. But among the items that you may want to just consider in general and discuss in general without making any decisions today would be, for example, do certain terms in 23630 need to be defined, either existing terms or whether new definitions should be articulated. There is a very specific matter or issue in the CDP that this body referred to the mayor and commissioner, they approved, which has to do with a site plan requirement for approving oceanfront commercial projects. So that's an obvious one that seems to me that this body is expected to take a look at, as early as next month. It's up to you. It's your meeting. It's not my meeting. I'm just here to facilitate. You might find today it's a good idea to talk about issues in general terms rather than specific terms. In other words, rather than trying to get into nitty-gritty and specific language here today, you might want to take a step back and say, well, gee, what issues should the building inspector really just go ahead and handle on his or her own and issue building permits on? Or what are some of the bigger issues that the Planning Commission really wants to take a look at and review and approve a site plan before a building permit is issued? And whether you call that a threshold issue or a trigger issue or a materiality issue doesn't matter. It's just basically what matters does this body want to take on its time. And these are, as you know, there's a considerable commitment of resources when you decide to take on the site plan review and approval process, including a public hearing. We talked about definitions, and then a final matter that you may want to talk about. There was this language in the existing 23630 having to do with rezonings and how just conceptually the Planning Commission wants to sequence a site plan review as compared to a variance or a rezoning request. These are different animals. What is the best sequencing of decision-making on that from a city's perspective, from a stakeholder perspective, and how do you want to spend your time and resources at what stage of the proceeding? So that would be one way to approach the discussion today in general terms, subject to more specific discussions on specific issues down the road.
And I circulated copies of Section 23630 through 32 to the commissioners, and hopefully you have those. If you still need them, I'll send them again, but for your review and consideration as we move forward. Again, it's a general discussion, but part of the concern as chair is that we use our time to the best way that we can and use our resources on those things that are really important. You may or may not want to look at every building permit application. I tend to doubt that. So at what threshold if you would, to look at 23630A and see just where the Planning Commission wants to get involved in the review once someone seeks a building permit. At what point do we get involved, and what are the parameters that we need to work with and work by? In terms of the sequencing, as I call it, the sequencing, you have instances where there may be a variance granted by the Board of Adjustment or a rezoning sought from the Board of Commissioners, and how does that interplay with our work in reviewing site plans? We need to have some clarity on that, I think. Those seem to be, and this seemed to be a good time to bring this up because we don't have a lot on our agenda today, perhaps not so much in October, but I think we're going to get very busy after that. So hopefully to take this interim period and consider what I would call some housekeeping matters that we really do need to look at. Does anybody have any questions about that? That's a long way of saying not much.
If I may suggest, just procedurally, it might be helpful to have the building inspector sort of advise the planning commission sort of a day in the life of the types of things that he sees on a regular basis to help inform the debate of what types of things you want to spend your time on as opposed to having him do.
Agreed. That sounds good.
Now, Mr. Janis, we don't want you to recount exactly what people say to you.
Yes, it is we definitely have I guess a negative connotation out on the streets. We're the no guys, unfortunately, right? We are the people who have to say no to people who, feel that they should be. It is their right to build whatever they want, no matter if it meets the code or not. So we definitely, obviously we get thrown under the bus quite frequently. Thankfully, we are all very used to it, and I think we work very well under that pressure. But at the same time, when we do tell them no, we also lead them down the path to a yes solution. So we're not just slamming the door in their faces and saying, absolutely not. We're saying, all right, this isn't going to be permissible, but maybe this is. So would you consider this in a correction of this application? Would you possibly consider this? Every day we have just a various amount of differentiating permits coming in from simply replacing a sidewalk to replacing a driveway, all the way up to, brand new construction. And we're just flooded on a constant basis. As you know, we are only 1 square mile, but I think we have enough building permits to sustain probably 5 to 8 square miles is what it seems like. Very consistent applications to recondition rental properties on a yearly basis. And of course, there is a big push to kind of recycle the housing as you can see with the number of demolitions and new houses that represent replacing those demolitions. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. If you have questions about the daily roll, I'm more than welcome to entertain those.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd
Mr.
actually
Strange.
like to make a comment, Mr. Janis. I think your group is perceived as the group of no, but that is really not the case, since I've had the opportunity to interact with your agency quite a bit. And one of the things that's essential is your gatekeepers. And it's surprising, as a matter of fact, and we've talked about this a couple times through you and your other staff, how many contractors don't understand the code at all and blatantly disregard it pay no attention to it, and then they get in the middle when the owner says, well, I was told I could do this, and you can't, and you guys end up taking the heat for it. That's inappropriate. Basically, that's all I wanted to say. I think that that's a very important function that you serve, and one thing, and really going along with Luke's observations, or his questions really, is as a planning commission, we have to deal with the incommensurable things, and you have to deal with the commensurable things. You have standards that are to be applied. And one of the things that concerns me, because I think it is difficult, and I'm not sure our code is really written that well, is under 275, the construal of provisions. And especially with redevelopment, it talks about the fact that higher standards apply. But it's hard to determine what those higher standards are. I mean, I know what they are philosophically, and can address that, and the CDP talks about that. But as a practical matter, it gets to be very difficult in terms of implementation, and I think that may lead to friction sometimes as to why people think they can do something when it appears they can do something when higher standards were not applied, and they should have been for redevelopment over a certain size. So I'll just make a comment on that issue.
I would just add to what Mike said, if I could, that your office deals with a very specific list of specific metrics and measurements. And the role of the Planning Commission, as it's laid out in the city code, is to consider a long list of other things as well. The impact on the community, the adjacent properties, the environment. You know, I can't remember, I think there are 20 or 21 separate items listed. Obviously, not every one of those would be relevant to every application, but it strikes me that one of the difficulties of being in your position is that you can't say in advance, this application is going to pass muster, because you are not, you know, reviewing those factors, and that's a built-in part of the structure of the system. And it's part of what the Planning Commission is, you know, created to do, is to sort of take that broader picture. So, and I'm sure that there are people who just, you know, want, you know, like the kind of feet and inches and, you know, square footage and square yardage, and for it to be cut and dried. So I think it's important for the public to understand that as well, that your office is not, you know, for the, you know, larger projects and so forth, is not set up to be the final say.
Thank you for that. And a lot of those plans that get pushed forward to you, I feel, are very much conceptual in nature. So they come to you, and it's my task to say, all right, this could, excuse me, this could meet the spirit of the code at this point. But oftentimes, things change when they submit for construction documentation, as we've seen in the past. I thank you for your kind words, and I just like to put it out there that at any time, the general public can come and talk to us at Building and Licensing and figure out those general rules. We find that if we can hold an hour-and-a-half meeting to let the applicants, the owners, the contractors know exactly what the code says, well, as much as possible, we find it, you know, obviously the process is a lot smoother. So our doors are always open. You're always welcome to schedule an appointment with one of the inspectors and to come and sit down and figure out exactly what it is you can do according to the code.
Well, I think the issue here is we've got some fairly general points in the code. I think there's 4 specific categories that say that a building permit can't be issued unless you know, these things have been analyzed, and there's a certain amount of discretion which the building inspector has. I think what we may need is a set of threshold requirements that say if this threshold is met, this needs to be referred to the Planning Commission for its review. For example, when a building permit is issued, if there are objections filed, is that something that should immediately be referred to the Planning Commission? Or is there beyond a certain degree of discretion by the building inspector, then it would be appropriate for it to be submitted to the Planning Commission? So I think we need a set of threshold requirements. For example, let's take another one. If there's a facade change. Now, not all facade changes need to be submitted to the Planning Commission, but if there's a particularly significant facade change, which would affect the aesthetics in the city or the impact on the general public, that may be something that should be submitted to the Planning Commission for comment by the building inspector. So I think that we do need a set of threshold requirements for things that are pretty clearly things that probably should be considered by the Planning Commission, which would help the building inspector deal with the applicants, and basically not have to bear the full burden of saying, this is just my decision.
I agree with you, Steve. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I agree with you, Stevie. I was thinking about this from a business perspective as a decision matrix, because there are going to be different scenarios that you'll get different projects around, right? And so you kind of need to know the path of what you should look at and then engage others. But the other step that I think we've all talked about and learned about through ClearSpace was engaging a planner too. So I think that's another decision point when a project is coming. When is the appropriate time to ask for that assistance and engage that resource too?
Yes, I was going to bring that up. The city has made available some funding for the Planning Commission. And these comments are to both Matt, to you, and to Nick. And I think it will give the commission the ability to seek additional expert input, reports, if you were, whatever. But if there are topics or subjects that you gentlemen, you can't know everything. And although I have some lawyer folks who I think would disagree with that. But you can't know everything. And so if you come upon a subject matter that is beyond what you normally do, beyond your expertise, we now have the capability to reach out to find consultants who may have that expertise. And so we encourage both of you to make that known early in the process, if you would. Because I think it's a huge resource, and I thank the city for that support, because it's important. Anyone else?
I'd like to
Nan? Ms.
go
Hunter?
to the question of sequence. Is that
Yeah.
appropriate at this point? Because, and just in terms of efficiency and our time and everyone else's time, because I know that one of the issues is whether, is the sequencing, I think as Luke referred to it, of when an applicant has to submit a site plan, but also has to get, for example, a variance. And I mean, Bellhaven Hotel is an obvious example of that. And it's now in litigation, and we don't really know when the litigation is going to be over. But I'm very concerned about just duplicative, repeated considerations about by this body. I don't have any, I mean, it's up to, the Board of Adjustment is a completely different thing. But it seems to me that if a site plan is going to come before us for final review, certainly, maybe preliminary review, that if it's contingent on a variance, that variance should be resolved before it gets to us. Otherwise, we're just going to be potentially going back and back and back. And I can't imagine that there's any gain to anybody in that process if the applicant has to keep coming back, if there's a decision by the Board of Adjustment and that decision is upheld, fine, that's one thing. If it's not upheld, then everything goes back to square one. And I just don't think we should have to redo our consideration and that it makes a lot more sense to say that the applications will come before us when those questions have been resolved, if there are questions, when those questions are resolved.
And I think that really can be broken down or bifurcated into two important topics. One is a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners for any necessary change to the municipal code to address this issue of what we call sequencing. I think that's become the buzzword. Because that ultimately is a code decision, and that is the Board of Commissioners' jurisdiction. But I think, Ms. Hunter, what we would do is consider that topic, and then as an equal topic, but something that's internal to us, is to consider an amendment of our procedures and rules to address the same type of issue. We have the power over those. We have jurisdiction to do that. So I ask the members of the commission to think in the same direction, but two different ideas. One for what it is we want to ask the Board of Commissioners to look at resolving and perhaps amending, and then for us internally, our rules and procedures to talk about exactly what Ms. Hunter just mentioned. We don't want to keep reviewing the same thing over and over based on where an appeal is or a variance is or a rezoning is. We need to have some finality on that so that we know when we act that hopefully it's the last time we'll have to look at it. Yes, sir, Mr. Kaufman.
Well, I agree with the chair's comments, and I also agree with Commissioner Hunter's comments. I think you're looking at an absolute requirement that we should be making a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners for some zoning or some code changes, because you're not going to be able to achieve these without that. If that should occur, then I think that it is appropriate that we look at our rules to accommodate those code changes. I also think there's a distinction between some of these reviews. For example, if an applicant wants just a conversation about a concept review, I'm not so sure that finality of other things such as a legal case or someone would necessarily be required for just a consideration or a discussion with us for the concept. But I agree that if we're talking about an application that requires some specific decisions, for example, like the Board of Adjustments, or if there's a lawsuit, there should be a final decision of that. This is my own opinion, there should be a final decision of that is not appealable. That means there's probably a few levels of court that it could go through before it would come to the Planning Commission. That would save a tremendous amount of time, resources. We're going to be very busy. As you can see, I don't think there's like 5 or 6 hotels that we're talking about here in the city. So I definitely feel, I don't know how the other members of the board feel, but I definitely feel that we should be making a recommendation after advice of counsel and our planning advisor to the Board of Commissioners for a zoning or a text amendment change to the ordinances.
All right, sir. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a different perspective and disagree with my colleagues with regard to variances. I think one of the critical issues related to expressly what Matt has to do is he determines if an application meets all the quote standards that are previously published and are in compliance with the CDP. If a variance is approved prior to any discussion whatsoever with the Planning Commission, I think that puts into the client's mind that, hey, I got the clear, I'm ready to go. However, when you look at the criteria of which we must apply to an application, it may or may not meet the requirements under the CDP and may or may not meet the requirements, the incommensurable things, the criteria of all the things that we're supposed to discuss. So it gives a false sense of security, which may not be real. I think what could be incorporated is when you have complex projects, and that's generally what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with the one-off small situation where someone wants to put something that's within 1 foot of a particular measurement that the code requires. We're dealing with major projects. And from that standpoint, I think the sketch plan review is an essential part of that process. And that's the non-legal part of it, where they get the input from a variety of people on the Planning Commission from a variety of perspectives, multiple disciplines. They get free to help them. And I think that's a very crucial process. Now, some people have elected to do that. And in one instance, I won't mention the hotel, which probably most people know it though, they went to the Board of Adjustment with support from the Planning Commission because it would in fact meet the CDP and better meet the criteria of what the city wanted to do. Now, in other situations, and I think there's one currently, where that didn't take place and individuals went to the Board of Adjustment, and as you pointed out, now that particular case is in the legal system. And I think that creates difficulty for us because the criteria we use is more than just the specifics that are called out explicitly in the building code. We have to do it on the basis of our charter, which has a different set of criteria. So my recommendation would be that perhaps, and then we get into the problem of what's major and what's minor, but it seems that the input from the Planning Commission helps round things out if in fact a variance may be needed, and that the client can go forward with the support of the Planning Commission, having dealt with all those incommensurable variables that are the real meat of the issue and the difficult part. If something meets the code, that's a piece of cake. That can be approved immediately, no problem whatsoever, except for a couple of criteria with major redevelopment. So I would take a counter position with regard to that proposal.
I'm not sure that's a counter position. I think it just addresses a different nuance of the issue.
Okay.
It really does.
In that case, I misunderstood it then.
In fact, I did indicate that a sketch plan is something if they came in with a sketch plan application, that's not something that I would want to see other requirements to be finalized before we would review it. So concept or sketch plan, whatever you want to call it, I think is something that they should have the right to bring to us because like you said, that would give them certain input, which is separate from this requirement that they're going through. So,
Well, it sounds like we have a lot to talk about. Yes, Mr. Ellison.
I just want to support, I think, what Steve is saying, and that is that you separate these two parts of our process. I would think we would want to encourage the early discussion with the Planning Commission on the part of any developer. And so I think what we're talking about being restrictive about is when it comes to the actual, in the site plan, the formal review itself only.
Yes, I think under our code, we have there's the concept review, which I think is what we're all talking about here. Right. And then there's the preliminary review, and there's certain requirements there. And then, of course, there's a final site plan approval. So it sounds like there's support for having the concept review. Just bring it on, let the commission, the building inspector, the planner will opine, let us all talk about what we see and what we think is needed. But if during that process there is other approvals needed by other bodies and those are not final, they are, for example, tied up in litigation. The question I think before us is, what do we do about that, if anything? What is our position about the resolution of those issues before it's acted on by this body?
I'll just jump in. If there is an issue with litigation that's tied up with some property, I think we should let that get settled before anything comes before us with the sketch plan, honestly. Sure. I don't think we should spend our time on that. But I would like to just say one more thing around the sketch plan, because we've been through this with another example of a project where a sketch plan came to us, and we were asked to make a decision at that time around the variance, and we didn't have enough information really to do that. But before we could make that decision on the variance, we had to actually just use the sketch plan. And several folks here were on that project, and that was difficult for us. We went back and forth on, do we really have enough information to make that decision? And we had to, because that's all we had to act on. But I do think we should have more information before we have to make those decisions. So if the sketch plan comes before us, it's great for discussion purposes, but I don't think we should be asked to make a decision on a variance, for example.
And I think really that's why we have a planner now that we didn't have before. And we have the availability of other consultants if we need them beyond the expertise that we have available here today. So thank you. I think we all lived through that one. We don't want to do that again, right?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
one last thing on this then. So I think it's incumbent upon us to ask our attorney and our planner to draft something for us to send to the Board of Commissioners for them to then formally introduce and take some action on, because we can't do anything without some change or decision by the Board of Commissioners.
Yes, sir. In my estimation, that's the next step. And thank you for that, because we wanted to have this general introductory discussion today and then move to putting Mr. Mehta to work and having whatever the discussion yields put in writing. And then at that point, now again, we have basically three issues. One, Section 23630A, what site plans, what must happen before a building inspector can issue a building permit? Does the Planning Commission need to be involved? Number two is the recommendation to the Board of Commissioners about possible changes to the city code, if any, but what are those? And with the understanding that that has to go to the Board of Commissioners, who then has to act, and that process will continue on in the future. And the third is any necessary changes to our procedures and rules, which we could go ahead and adopt prior to the Board of Commissioners doing their work on the code itself. So I think we have three different areas to look at, and I definitely think we should task Mr. Mehta with putting pen to paper.
Right.
Anyone object to that?
No objection. I mean, my my only comment would be that, I think we can and should go ahead and adopt a new rule of procedure for ourselves, which we can do. And I would just encourage us to sort of move the sequencing issue sort of to the front, because that we don't have to go through all the trigger criteria in 23630A to figure that out, right? I mean, we could leave it as is or change it all or whatever, but it feels to me, especially in light of the realities of what we're looking at in the next few months, that having clarity about that, because we do know there's at least one case that already is in litigation. I don't know if there will be others. I don't know if there will be other proposals that will be contingent on a variance or the same kind of variance. But if there are, I think it's only fair to everyone, including the applicants, to take that position in advance before people invest the time, money, and resources in coming up with a full-scale site plan proposal.
Agree with that?
Mr. Mehta.
May I? So we'll do whatever you ask us to do. I don't do stuff unless you ask us to do it, but if you ask us to do it, we'll do it.
Back tomorrow?
You may want to, in terms of sequencing, there's an express referral on the statutory issue, and then there's the rules issue as well. I do think there's there'd be good reason to look at both things. So Commissioner Macha, for example, on your issue, one idea, for example, is to amend your rules. I don't think you need to change the code to do this, just to require more information be submitted to the Planning Commission as part of as a submittal. And I think that could easily be done, or to make it clear the extent of written materials submitted by what date, so the commission has adequate time to consider it. And again, I think on this sequencing issue, it sounds to me like there's some there are many views as to what modifications could be made in a rule change as opposed to a code change. So that's certainly something we can look at. We'll be transparent with you about it, and ultimately you'll be transparent with the public and the Board of Commissioners.
Well, do we have a consensus among the commissioners that Mr. Meadows should at least start on that subject, our bylaws and our procedures? So that we can, and I was, during a previous application, I was particularly concerned about the fact there didn't seem to be any deadlines by which an applicant can simply file something and wishes to have it considered up to the day of the hearing, during the hearing. And so I think that's important. We need to lay down some markers so that this commission has documentary evidence in time to look at it and consider it. So is there a consensus to have Mr. Mehta start on the bylaws and procedures?
Yes.
Yes, and does that also apply to us as well? To also put those markers in place for the applicant? Because it does feel like at times we didn't do that, and my sideline view felt like those applicants were kind of moving around to different entities within the city and not getting anywhere, right? And I think that's frustrating for them too. But
Well,
I
I
think
think
we need
if-
to be timely in our response back to those applicants as well.
Let's talk about that because let's discuss that. I'm trying to think of how that might. Good ideas that don't work are bad ideas, and so I get a little concerned if something it looks like this is what should happen, but how do you implement it to make it really happen? I think we would need to discuss that, just how
I
you
agree.
get from here to there.
But I think it could
Excuse
be on both sides.
Yeah,
That's what my
okay.
point is.
All right, anything else on this particular topic?
Mr. Chair, can I interject real quick? And members, Mr. Mehta, with all due respect, excuse me, on a concept review, we are not tasked to offer any report. So you may, if that is what you would like to require, you may want to get that into the language.
Okay. That
That's
you do
something
some
you-
type of report, some type of preliminary review?
Correct. So in a concept review, if it's a site plan review, obviously I have the charges to answer to.
Right.
But if for a concept, it is them presenting to you all and just getting a general feeling of that concept. We really don't offer anything because at that stage, they're typically not giving us enough information to determine any code compliance or any, structural integrities or anything of that nature. At that point, it's just a nice, pretty picture with a couple colors on it, hopefully.
Do the commissioners have any thoughts on that?
Well, I just had a question. So do you think that there needs to be something in our rules, or do you think there needs to be something in the code? I'm not quite sure where that requirement would be for you to do some sort of analysis, so.
Thank you. It was just a point for conversation as it was brought up from a concept review. There was some rumblings about a report being issued, but as it stands right now, we are not held to issue a report for a concept review. I just wanted to bring that to light.
Yeah, I don't see where our rules could affect you. In other words, I think it's something that the commissioners would have to ask you to do when a concept is requested.
Right. Bottom line is, if you want it, get it into the code.
Right. Thank you.
All right, anything else? Yes, Mr. Allison.
Oh, I think we ought to take Matt up on that and suggest that to the Board of Commissioners, because, we can't be helpful unless we have all the information that's available, as limited as it may be early on at the conceptual stage. We still, ought to offer that we would be able to meet with, an applicant. And I think it would be very helpful to know, however limited it is, what Matt has to offer. And so that would be a simple matter, in my view, for us to ask the commissioners to make that a requirement, if that's what it is.
I think it's important to remember also that at that stage, at a concept review, the plans have not been developed to that state yet. So I think you've got to be careful on inadvertently causing the applicant to take conceptual review to a stage where now it offers structural analyses or systems. At a concept stage, I think that's asking them too much.
But you would be willing to respond to any inquiries from the commission about a concept plan?
Absolutely. As always, we are there for those meetings, and if you have questions at that time, we certainly can answer those questions. And I believe it's just customary that we maybe offer a memo to the Planning Commission with some potential triggers that we might see, but as far as a requirement for the code, it is not required at this point.
Mr. Ellison, is that satisfactory?
Yes, yeah, I think we should have that.
All right. On a topic that's somewhat related, I've been in touch with DENREC and Danielle Swallow at the University of Delaware, and am in discussions with them about holding a workshop with the Planning Commission. If you look at section 236 subparagraph E, it talks about that the Planning Commission shall consider other applicable state, county, and city laws and regulations when it's reviewing, site plan. And so I've asked them if they could at least speak to us about what these other issues might be, what other applicable laws, whether it's federal, state, et cetera. And so we're in discussions to try and schedule a workshop where they can at least come to us and say, okay, Planning Commission, here my thought is this. We focus on the code, that's sort of our Bible, but they know about a lot of other things that impact what applications come before us. And I think it might be helpful, subject to your approval, that if they can at least have a workshop and talk about those things, make us aware that there's something beyond this code for us to consider when we're looking at a site plan. Any thoughts on that? Do you want to have a workshop?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I mean, personally, I think it's really important that we sort of bring in, on a variety of issues, but especially environmental issues. And, that, to me, that's an area where the dynamics and the standards are probably most likely to evolve most quickly, in a relatively short period of time. So I would really welcome that.
Well, I'll try to give everybody, I'll try to pick some dates and give everybody notice, and you tell me what works. We may actually take a regular monthly meeting and reschedule it to accommodate their schedule. But I'll certainly get back to you and see what we can get done there.
Mr. Chair, may I weigh in on that issue just very briefly?
Absolutely.
For what it's worth, I'm not a voting member of this body, but I think this idea is a very good idea, and regardless of what the DENREC folks say, and regardless of what they may determine is currently applicable laws and regulations, that discussion might foster a discussion at the city level as to whether new laws ought to be adopted on what I think is a pretty important issue for a beach town on the Atlantic coast. One other thing, if I may, and I don't want to put Mr. Janus on the spot, but since I've just been tasked with something for the next 30 days minus 7, so whatever that is, it might help me a little bit, if I may
Yes, sir.
ask. To what extent do you want to have ideally, from your perspective, the discretion or not to refer a project to this body, or not to refer, in your discretion, a project to this body where, in your discretion, where it's not clear, hopefully we make it very clear, what may be required to be sent to the Planning Commission for site plan review? In other words, to what extent let's assume we draft a beautiful statute that's very clear. But do you still, you still want to have discretion one way or the other to refer or not refer a matter to this body?
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. I think, no matter what code you develop, there's always going to be a loophole somewhere with it. There's going to be a way around it. And really, when it ultimately comes right down to the boards, the commissions, they're the rule makers. They're the rule setters, the lawmakers, if you will. It is up to you guys, I think, to see, to set those parameters for me to work under. And I'm more than willing, we're a very bendable, pliable department, contrary to popular belief. But I'm more than willing to follow those guidelines. And if it comes up to discretion, I'd sooner have that removed from me so that it's spelled out correctly. It's right down to the T, to the meaning of the code, to the spirit of the code.
Commensurable stuff.
Yeah.
Would you like to, the reserved authority to refer something to the Planning Commission for review just because you think the Planning Commission would like to look at it or should look at it? In other words, should there be some discretionary right for you to say, I've got this, yes, it meets this or that and the other, but I really want the Planning Commission to look at this as well?
Thank you, Chair. I'm torn with that because I'm a big property rights guy, which makes me kind of a building inspector that's is torn, if you will. But I'm definitely for the property rights of the owners, and I want to be careful, obviously, to how much we tread on those property rights, whether be inadvertently or not. We are still in America, I believe, and we still have the right to, develop our own lands.
Mr. Janis, is that a no?
Potentially. It's a potential no. How about that?
Okay, fair enough.
Well, I was going to say, Matt you have that discretion right now for major projects.
I feel I have too much discretion at this point. I would like the codes to be brought in.
Cogent, so you don't have to deal with that.
Correct.
Okay, I think that's a valid position.
Can I speak to that?
Yes, of course.
I think it's very important for the building inspector or any public servant to have a certain degree of discretion. As public servants, and I was one for a long time before I was in private practice, you really have the responsibility to the public to find a way to say yes if it's within the legal parameters and it's in your discretion or view good for the public. So I think a certain amount of discretion is very important. It's a question of not absolute discretion, so there's a balance in there.
Right.
And so I think it's really important for you as a building inspector to have discretion. I wouldn't want to take that away from you. I don't want everything to be black and white, cookie cutter. Yes, it goes. No, it doesn't. A building inspector needs to have discretion to a certain degree. I understand your issue where you're overwhelmed with so many things that you need some limitations on that. But I don't want it to be that we take away that full discretion from you. That's just my thoughts.
I can certainly appreciate that, Mr. Kaufman. Absolutely.
All right. I think we've run through our agenda. Is there anything else that needs to be discussed here today? It is good to see everybody, or most everybody, with Mr. Julie and Barry. Ms. Secretary.
Do you have a comment before you adjourn? We do have a concept review that was submitted for the planning commission to review.
Oh, so it's pending at this point?
It's in my office.
Okay. All right. Well, good. We won't run out of agenda items anytime soon. Yes, sir.
If I may just offer one tidbit, when I did my master's program at the University of Delaware, worked with the Institute for Public Administration, who is the group that DENREC referenced and recommended for outreach to support any workshops or anything. I just want to provide my opinion that it's a fantastic group with a tremendous body of knowledge that, from my perspective, can absolutely provide clarity and guidance on local planning matters, state and regional as well. So I would support that effort to reach out if that is the decision of the commission.
Yes, well, I think that's what we're going to do.
And if I can help facilitate that in any way, please, I'm happy to do so.
I've got your phone number. Thank you. Anything else? We're adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thought that was good.